In this section, we'll look at how during Reagan's second term, direct bilateral relations with the Soviet Union had a dramatic shift from Reagan's first term. And the most significant development in this was the emergence in 1985 of Mikhail Gorbachev to power in the Soviet Union. And all this is going to prove tremendously important in sort of ending the Cold War. Gorbachev had been born in 1931, and thus he was only 54 years at old, and he was young. He was the father of a combine harvester and a World War II veteran. And Gorbachev had rose in the Communist Party ranks and had taken power after Chernenko's death. He had long been seen as a reformer and immediately promised to pursue arms control and economic reforms. Gorbachev promised to pursue economic restructuring that was termed perestroika, the idea being that they would allow more private property and more individual initiative, and that would stimulate the economy. Gorbachev also unveiled glasnost, which was sort of an opening, a little more free speech. And everybody kind of wondered whether this was actually just a slogan or going to go forth. But when Gorbachev allowed the dissident writer Andrei Sakharov to be released, it was obvious that Gorbachev was going to allow a little more free speech and free thought in the Soviet Union. The reasons for perestroika and glasnost were pretty obvious. It was the really poor situation of the Soviet Union at the time. And the stores were empty, and there were long lines, and morale was low, and so perestroika and glasnost were tended to have sort of a reset in the Soviet Union. Gorbachev came to power, and the first thing he announced was he was going to reduce the number of the SS-20s, the INF missiles in Europe. And therefore, Reagan allowed arms negotiations to resume in earnest. And in November 1985, Reagan even agreed to meet Gorbachev in Geneva. And you can see them here shaking hands across the table. In Geneva, Gorbachev offered to reduce Soviet missiles in exchange for the United States keeping development of its so-called Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, or as it was known by some critics, Star Wars, confined to the laboratory. The SDI used satellites and lasers, the idea being that it could detect a missile launch, an ICBM launch, and then shoot it out before it hit its intended target. This was technologically impossible at the time, but the United States was rushing to make it possible. Gorbachev and Reagan didn't have an agreement in Geneva, but they did sort of hit it off personally. And the diplomacy that would follow sort of encouraged détente. And, they almost developed a friendship, and that undoubtedly changed Reagan's view of the Soviet Union. Reagan realized that Gorbachev was a different animal than what had come before. Gorbachev didn't give up. In January 1986, he offered a plan that would reduce Soviet and American nuclear arsenals by half in a period of 5 to 8 years and would eliminate all nuclear arsenals by the year 2000. These proposals were enlarged at another Reagan-Gorbachev summit in Reykjavik, Iceland in October 1986. And you can see them here or there. And here, the Soviets leader offered the elimination of all nuclear weapons in a decade and the limitation of SDI in the laboratory. Despite what seemed to be a possibility of a real breakthrough, Reagan could not agree to drop SDI. He saw it as just too important a bargaining chip, and thus it sort of doomed any agreement at Reykjavik. Arms control negotiations nevertheless continued in the aftermath of Reykjavik. In February 1987, Gorbachev separated the INF Treaty from other agreements, and quickly progress was made in negotiations. On September 18th, Secretary of State George Shultz and Soviet Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze announced agreement on an INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces and Intermediate Nuclear Range Missiles Treaty, that eliminated intermediate nuclear weapons from Europe and provided for an unprecedented system of verification. Reagan famously said, "Trust but verify." In early December 1987, Gorbachev arrived in Washington for a third superpower summit in which the INF Treaty was signed. The two leaders solidified their close relationship when Reagan was invited to come to Moscow the following summer. Signed on December 8th, the INF Treaty was the first in the world history in which nuclear weapons would actually be eliminated, although it reduced nuclear arsenals by only 4%. The treaty provided for the destruction of 859 American missiles and over 1,800 Soviet missiles over a 3-year period. After conservative Republican opposition during the Senate debate, the INF Treaty was indeed ratified in May of 1988 by a vote of 95-3. So it's odd that Reagan's second term saw such a warming of relations given how harsh his rhetoric had been in his first term. This concludes the Soviet reset in Reagan's second term.